And I'm going to mute everybody. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There is a chat feature that you can put questions into the chat. You can also raise your hand, and if you have a question, and we will have also a question and answer portion of the evening as well. So I'm going to mute everybody now just to keep noise down. And then Lucy, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much for having me. So we will go on our waiver journey tonight. Waivers are a complicated topic, to say the very least. So I could probably talk about waivers. I have talked about waivers for many hours on end, but tonight we'll go over what I'll call the waiver basics, like the most important things to know about waivers. And as Christina said, I'm happy to take questions. Generally speaking, I don't get to them till at the end because waivers are complicated and not especially intuitive or linear. So I may say something and you think like, oh, I have a question about that, but I go into that thing in detail a little bit later on. So sometimes it's worth holding on tight, but I promise I'll get to any questions you all have. Otherwise, I'm available anytime going forward on email to answer questions. So I believe that the slides are up for my presentation. Someone chime in if that's not true.
You are presenting.
Okay, super. All right, so I work at the ARC of Northern Virginia. We have been around in Northern Virginia for 65 plus years. A fair amount of what we do is advocacy, so making sure people with disabilities and their families know what's going on that could impact them and encouraging them to take part in making sure they're standing up for their rights and speaking at public hearings and getting laws passed and budgets funded and those kinds of things that are helpful for folks with disabilities. And one of the things we fight for is funding for Medicaid waivers. We also do a lot of education workshops like this, loads of free information and referral all day long. People ask us all manner of questions, and we are happy to help find a resource or a doctor or answer a complicated question or navigate tricky situations. We have a large team of case managers for some of the waivers, so we deal with waivers very firsthand on a day-to-day basis. We operate a public guardianship of last resort program for individuals who really need a guardian but don't have anyone in their life who would be appropriate to serve. We have a special needs trust that I'll allude to a little bit later because it ties in with waivers. And we have a very cool tech for independent living team that works on apps, like on your phone apps, to help people learn to take Metro, bus, and rail more independently and learn to work more independently and be more independent in their daily lives. They do all kinds of very cool stuff. Tonight, I wanted to talk a bit about the purpose and description of waivers. What are they? Why are we going to talk about them? Then we'll go through eligibility criteria for the waiver. So how would you know if it's something that's a good fit for you or your loved one? And then we'll talk about waiver services. So once we kind of really deeply understand what waivers are, then we'll talk about how you apply for the various waivers and how to navigate the waiting list if you're put on a waiting list for waivers. And then my contact information is at the end. Right, so purpose and description of waivers. The term Medicaid waiver and waiver, for the purposes of this presentation at least, are interchangeable. They're called Medicaid waivers because in order to receive one of these Medicaid waivers, it's paid for by Medicaid. So the person with a disability themselves will get Medicaid when they get a waiver. The waiver has nothing to do with the waiver of rights or options or resources by the person with a disability or their family. It's a federal term, essentially meaning that usually under Medicaid programs, there are a lot of very strict rules. Some of those rules are waived, which allows Virginia to offer extra services to folks with disabilities. Waivers are really important to consider because they are meant to be a one-stop shop. So if someone has low needs or high needs, behavioral needs or medical care needs, is young or old, needs help before school and after school or post-graduation, in all of these situations, the waiver is the support package there to serve them. It offers supports across the lifespan. So once someone is given a waiver, so long as they continue to be eligible, they'll have it for their entire life. It is the only public funding stream for long-term supports. So you can find some small pockets of money occasionally for maybe short-term employment coaching or things like that. But if you need long-term supports, more than just a few months, waivers are it. And they're free or low cost for the person with a disability, kind of depending upon the financial situation just of the person with a disability, not the family. So really, really critical to look at. There are two types of waivers that we're really going to talk through tonight. The first are the developmental disability waivers, and those are the three waivers in the top of the screen in blue. The community living waiver, family and individual supports waiver, and building independence waiver are their names. But really, I'm going to treat them like a block of one tonight, in part because really as a group, they are called the 3DD waivers. They're all for people with developmental disabilities, but you apply at the same place for them. They have most of the same services. They share a waiting list. You're not waiting for one in particular. You're waiting for one of those at any given time. So really for the purposes of navigating waivers right up until you have one, they're functionally the same. And they have the same eligibility criteria. And then we'll talk about the Commonwealth Coordinated Care, or CCC plus waiver. So some folks may know the term EDCD waiver that was around prior to 4 years ago. This is the rebirth of that waiver, if you will. So just kind of look at it at a high level. We're going to go back and forth tonight with everything we talk about. We'll compare the DD waivers, that set of 3 waivers, with the CCC plus waiver. So we'll start now. First, for the DD waivers, you need a developmental disability diagnosis. So as people with disabilities yourselves, as parents or caregivers, you'll know what that is. That'll be a diagnosis of autism, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, a host of chromosomal abnormalities, all kinds of diagnoses and diseases that fall under the category of developmental disability. The DD waivers are great insofar as they offer a really long menu of services for people in a myriad of situations. So for young kids, they offer in-home supports. As that child may grow up, it can offer supports in the community as they go out and learn how to navigate stores and shops and movie theaters and all kinds of social situations more independently. And as they leave their family home, it'll help them navigate employment and residential services and aging in place and long-term health care and all kinds of things. So really large menu of service options that we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later. The DD waiver funds up to 24/7 staffing if that's what someone needs. And by 24/7 staffing, I mean 24/7 awake staffing. If someone truly needs someone awake with eyes on them every single second of every single day, the DD waiver can find that. The DD waiver has a case manager whose sole job it is to work with people with disabilities and their loved ones to help them figure out how to pair their needs with waiver services and community-based supports and grants and all kinds of creative thinking to build a life that that person with the disability wants. The downside to the DD waivers is they have a long waiting list. I'm going to talk more about the waiting list later in the presentation. There's not an easy answer I can give you to how long it is, which is why it's kind of a topic for later, but this is a little bit of a teaser of what we'll be talking about. By comparison, let's look at the CCC plus waiver. For that waiver, you need a disability diagnosis. Notice I didn't say developmental disability. It can be a very wide range of disabilities, but you also have to have a significant medical need. There is no black and white list of what a significant medical need is. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but it's someone who needs more help than reminders to take medications or things like that. It's someone who needs some kind of significant oversight or assistance with medical supports over the course of the day. It has a much shorter menu of services than the DD waiver. It doesn't offer residential services. It doesn't offer employment and day services. It does offer some supports in the home and some help with nursing. There's a 56-hour-a-week cap on the personal care, that personal care aide who would come in and help you with the CCC plus waiver. There is no case manager to help you navigate all the intricacies of the waiver services and make sure everything fits, but there's also no waiting list. So the reason we talk about both is because at any given point in time, about a quarter to a third of the people waiting for a DD waiver also happen to have a significant medical need. So that quarter to a third of people waiting for a DD waiver can apply for and use the CCC plus waiver sort of as a lifeline in the meantime. So the reason we'll talk about them both tonight really is ultimately because the DD waiver had a waiting list. And if we get to the point when the DD waiver has no waiting list, then I probably won't talk about the CCC plus waiver very much anymore. It's not the ultimate destination waiver, if you will. It's not where you want to ultimately be because it doesn't fund very many services compared to the DD waiver, but it can be a really great short-term option while you're waiting for something bigger. So now we'll talk about eligibility for the waivers. And just like we just did, I'll talk first about eligibility for the DD waivers, then about eligibility for the CCC plus waivers. And there are 3 parts to eligibility: your diagnosis, functional criteria, that means how much help you need, and financial criteria. So first, let's look at the diagnosis and the diagnostic needs for folks on the developmental disability waiver. This is the actual definition of what Virginia considers to be a developmental disability, and it's long. Like we talked about before, you know, if you or your loved one has a developmental disability, it onset in childhood, meaning before 22. It's going to have long-term effects. They need help in a variety of life areas, and you're providing supports to them to make sure that they're as successful and as independent as possible, is kind of the basic bones of it. The diagnosis for CCC plus waiver, like we talked about, are a little trickier. So your developmental disability diagnosis here will meet the disability part, but then we also need a healthcare or a medical related diagnosis. There is no, like I said, really clear list that I could give you to say, if you have this diagnosis, you'll definitely be eligible, because it's not really based upon your medical diagnosis. It's based upon the needs you have to support that diagnosis. There's a green link in the middle of the screen here, and I'm happy to share these slides, of course, for a really great self-assessment you can find online that a group put out that says, like, if you're not sure if you're going to be eligible for this waiver, take this self-assessment, answer these 5 or 10 questions online and click and figure out you're likely to be eligible. It's worth a call, or you're probably not eligible. Try back later if you get a new diagnosis. So some of the things we look for with this, seizure disorders are very common in the developmental disability community. So if someone has an epilepsy diagnosis, but they got that diagnosis when they were 2 and now they're 20, and they haven't had a seizure in 15 years, and they don't even bother going to see the neurologist again every year, that's not going to count as a medical need. But if they have an epilepsy diagnosis and they do see the neurologist every 6 months, if there's a seizure protocol at home and at school that everybody has to be trained on, if folks have to know how to monitor for active and absent seizures, if that student takes a number of seizure medications that parents have to administer, those kinds of things may qualify that student with a disability as having both the developmental disability and the medical need to be eligible for the CCC plus waiver. So again, I just really want to hammer, it's not that they have a medical needs diagnosis, it's that someone in their life, a parent or a professional, is using special kind of medical skills to monitor for medical supports or to provide medical supports. That can be things like range of motion exercises. It can be a whole host of things, but really that someone in their life is either a professional or trained by a professional to offer medical supports. So now we'll look at functional eligibility. So hopefully now you have a sense of, does my diagnosis qualify me for one or both of those waivers? Functional eligibility for the DD waivers, it's all the same assessment for all 3 of those waivers, and it's done through an assessment called the VIDES, and VIDES is an acronym for the Virginia Individual Developmental Disabilities Eligibility Survey, which is a really accurate title, but also a very long title. That's why everyone calls it the VIDES. There's a version of the VIDES for wee ones under age 3. Then for kiddos 3 until the day before they turn 18, then for adults 18 plus. And all of those assessments compare people with disabilities to typically developing peers in a variety of life areas. So does the person with a disability have more communication needs than the average typically developing person their age, more behavioral support needs, more medical oversight needs, more life skill learning needs, all those kinds of things. The ARC of Northern Virginia, if you go to our website, thearcofnova.org, at the very top of the page, you can click Resource Library and then the waivers section. And there we have a copy of all the VIDES. And I feel like in life, if someone willingly gives you the test you're going to have to take ahead of time, by all means, look at that test, study that test, know that test. So if you're going to apply for the waiver, know that the questions on the VIDES are the questions they are going to ask you. Take some time to go over it. The scoring guide is right on the front. You can see if I answer the questions this way and I flip back to the front, does that mean I'm eligible or not? You can see how for some folks who are more independent, that eligibility can hinge on the cusp of 1 or 2 questions. So again, really great to know that ahead of time and to be prepared. The VIDES asks personal questions about bathing and bathroom habits, the kinds of things that we don't necessarily want to discuss in mixed company. So being prepared for that ahead of time is a good kind of thing. Making sure that the person with a disability knows that they're going to be present for that assessment to the greatest possible degree, and that the word of the caregiver Whether or not that person is a minor or over 18, whether or not there's a guardian, those kinds of things are irrelevant. But the word of the caregiver is usually taken as gospel, because the assessors are not new to the fact that sometimes folks with developmental disability say, nope, I don't need help with that. I don't need help with that. I do all that just fine. Then it's your job as the caregiver in the meeting to say, actually, as a reminder, here's what I do to help with that. And then the assessor can take that into account. For the CCC Plus waiver, functional eligibility is assessed differently. They do it with a tool called the Uniform Assessment Instrument, or UAI. And if you've ever been or had a loved one in a long-term hospital stay, nursing home, rehab center, it's the same assessment. It is a series of questions that mostly focuses on hands-on care for bathing, dressing, and using the restroom, and medical support needs. And it is fairly redundant, in my opinion. It's going to ask lots of questions about those categories of life over and over. Unlike the VIDES, there is not a scoring guide right on the front where you can go back and see, oh, if I answer the questions this way, I can actually see I'm eligible, but it will give you a very good sense. Am I saying yes to most of these questions, or am I rarely saying yes? It's a good bellwether for you. And then financial eligibility is identical, essentially, for the DD waivers and the CCC Plus waiver, looking only at the person with a disability. If that person is 1 week old or 10 years old or 100 years old, they're only looking at the person with a disability. Does that person with a disability have less than $2,382 a month in income? That's the 2021 number. It's adjusted for inflation. If they have more than about $1,200 a month, they start to have a copay towards some of their services. But as long as they're under that cap of $2,382, they're eligible on the income side. Children aren't deemed as people who have assets. So assets like if you had a savings plan in your child's name, or I don't know, grandma left them a stock or a savings bond or whatever it is. As long as they're under 18, that doesn't matter. But the day they turn 18, waiver will care about all those things. So if the person with a disability has, like I said, $2,001 in their savings account and they flip over that $2,000 cap, they would be ineligible for all of their waiver services unless that money was put into or held in a special needs trust or an ABLE account. So like I talked about way in the beginning, at the ARC of Northern Virginia, we operate a special needs trust. And this is why, because we've seen that without it, it's a big barrier to folks who are trying to access services. So a special needs trust is essentially a bank account. That means you can save money that Medicaid and Social Security will look at, but cannot consider and cannot count against you in figuring out if the person is eligible for services. So it's different than a regular savings account, but it means that people with disabilities don't have to be in poverty forever, that they can inherit money from parents or life insurance policies or aunts and uncles or whoever else has the option to leave money for them, knowing that it won't eliminate their eligibility for the benefits that they need. Our director of trust is here. If anyone's interested, I would say the arcofnovatrust.org is the easiest place to go. And then across the top of the screen, there's a bar for events and workshops, and just sign up for a free one and go kind of learn about it. Okay. So there's kind of the basics of waivers. We've got our 3 DD waivers and our CCC Plus waiver. We have a good sense now about whether or not we're eligible for one or both. And now let's talk about the services that they offer, bearing in mind that the services a particular person is offered is going to depend upon their actual needs at any given point in time. So if someone didn't need nursing, for example, they're not going to offer you nursing services. There are a few slides like this. You don't have to read all of them. It's just to kind of give you a very loose sense of service options. So across the top, you can see the 3 DD waivers, the community living, family and individual supports, and building independence waiver. And you can see that on every slide, all of them offer some flavor of services. So this slide looks at residential services, and you can see all of them offer some kind of residential services. By comparison, on the far side of the slide, the CCC Plus waiver offers 0 residential services. So something to think about. The 3 DD waivers offer a range of residential services, and someone can move between them over time. Maybe someone who is freshly graduated from school and moving out on their own for the first time is going to need a place that has 24/7 staff, but over a few years they build their independent living skills and they go down to living with a roommate and staff that's there only during waking hours or only dropping in, or whatever kind of mix of supports that person needs. The waivers can offer traditional group homes, all kinds of mixed living situations where maybe there's a caregiver in the house who lives there, who doesn't have a disability, and they're sleeping overnight. If your loved one is safe with someone overnight who's sleeping, so long as there's someone there, if there's a fire alarm or an emergency or something quirky happens. So there's a big mix of residential services that are meant to be paired with someone when they're ready for them. Now we'll go on to day and employment services. As you can see here, the 3 DD waivers, all of them offer essentially the full gamut of day and employment services. No matter which DD waiver you get, day and employment options are yours aplenty. And again, by comparison, the CCC Plus waiver doesn't offer any day or employment services. People can mix their day and employment services. So maybe one day a week they'll work on volunteering, and maybe one day a week they'll work on skill building, and maybe one day a week they'll work in a one-on-one setting with someone on breaking down some of the kind of the challenging behaviors they have that prevent them from working. And then maybe one day a week they'll work part-time, right? It's meant to be a flexible system where the schedule is essentially customized to the person with a disability. For many years, we had a service called pre-vocational supports. And when the Department of Justice came into Virginia a number of years ago, they found that people had been in pre-vocational supports for decades, which really begs the question, where on earth is this vocation, right? And so what they found was we need a way for people, instead of saying, I'm either not at all ready for employment and I'm totally ready for employment, to build up the whole spectrum in between, to say, I'm ready for part-time employment, I'm ready for volunteer work, I'm ready for some skill building, I'm ready for those things to get me closer to employment. Now we'll talk about some services that can be provided in-home. And by that, I mean if the person with a disability is living home with family or living in their own apartment by themselves or with friends or whatever the situation is, these are services that can be provided. And here our CCC Plus waiver finally gets on the map, if you will. So the waivers offer a one-to-one person who can come help with skill building or kind of activities of daily living, making food, cleaning the house, taking personal care of themselves, those kinds of things. The waivers offer respite care. So on a regular schedule, you would have your staff support, your drop-in support, your aid, but respite care hours are there if there's a time when you need more supports. So for school-age kids, I had a lot of families who used respite care heavily over things like winter or spring break or summertime when the hours that you needed were a little bit out of the norm from usual, or if there's a time when a parent was going to be traveling or a parent was going to be ill or having surgery, those kinds of things, and you needed to pull in some extra hours. And the waivers can offer up to $5,000 a year to change the home of the person with a disability or their car or the car that's used to drive them. So that can be things like widening doorways or ramps, electronic keypads that are needed to exit the home if the person has a history of elopement. There's all kinds of cool stuff that folks can do. And then there are community-based supports. And again, we see here the CCC Plus waiver offers only one of these, but all 3 of the DD waivers offer really the full gamut. So they offer assistive technology, which would be up to $5,000 a year for portable tech that helps the person be safer, more independent, communicate better. Communication devices are probably the most commonly requested sort of thing, but there's a big range. You know, travel training apps and programs and all kinds of cool stuff that folks may use. The waivers now all offer electronic home-based supports. So that would be like smart home technology. So if a barrier to someone living more independently was that they forgot to shut off the stove and close the fridge door, then they could put in an alarm on the fridge that would start chiming after 30 seconds if it wasn't closed, and that would automatically shut off the stove if it hadn't been touched in however many minutes. There's really cool stuff that can be done. And lastly, the waiver offers some medical-based support. So usually that's in-home nursing. It can take other forms, but generally speaking, that's what we see the most of. And the CCC Plus waiver offers a little bit of that. So now that we understand kind of which waivers are we eligible for, what could we really get with that waiver, let's talk about how to apply. So I have the number for all the local CSBs on here, but Arlington's right there at the top, 228-1700. And you're calling your local community services board, and all you're saying is, I'd like to apply for a DD waiver. And they'll screen you on the phone. They'll ask you a few questions. You know, what's your name? Where do you live? Then they should send a big stack of paperwork out to you that's a lot of signatures. You'll return that paperwork along with a copy of a psychological evaluation. It could be the same one that was done through the schools that's showing this student with a disability has a developmental disability diagnosis. They'll want the proof of that at that time. And then they'll say, great, it looks like you've met the diagnostic eligibility. Then what we're going to look at next is your functional eligibility. We're going to sit down and do that VIDES assessment we talked about earlier, where we talk about how much help do you need for these various life areas and making sure that essentially you have enough need that it would make sense to offer you a waiver. So then we say, okay, we've got your diagnostic need and your functional need. You're eligible for a waiver. Then we're going to put you on a waiting list. Again, more on that in a moment. For the CCC Plus waiver, you're calling your local Department of Social Services. So for Arlington, 703-228-1297. There's a more in-depth phone screening than there is for the DD waiver. So right there on the phone, they'll ask you a lot of questions about, are there hands-on care needs? Are there medical needs? Who supports those needs? All those kinds of things. So I'd be prepared for a longer phone call. 30, 40 minutes, can go longer or shorter. If that phone call goes well, then they'll send a nurse out to the home of the person with the disability to essentially ask the exact same questions in person. And if they say, great, it seems like you're totally eligible here, then they'll start the process of enrolling, because this waiver has no waiting list time whatsoever. It's a government program and there's lots of paperwork and things to put in order. So functionally speaking, realistically speaking, there's no waiting list. But honestly, if you picked up the phone tomorrow and called and were told, we're sending out a nurse, it's going to take that nurse a few weeks to come. It's going to take you all some time to get the paperwork back to her, time to get Medicaid in place, time to get all the supports and services in place. So it's usually a couple of 2-3 months, sometimes 4 or 5, before really services begin. Can go slower or faster. Okay, so if the waiver that you are eligible for is the DD waiver, then let's talk about what you do while you're on that waiting list. All of the DD waivers share a waiting list. So you're not waiting for just the community living waiver or just the family and individual supports waiver or just the building independence waiver. The state recognizes that at the point at which you get on the waiting list for waivers, your service needs may look very different than when you were later offered one. So what they do is say, if you're on this waiting list, we're going to put folks in order based upon urgency of need. The more needs you have and the more significantly you need supports, the higher up that waiting list you're going to go. Then they do sort of a matchmaking process where our state government will fund waivers. Right now our General Assembly session's going on, and let's say, I'm just making up numbers, let's say they fund 100 community living waivers and 500 family and individual supports waivers and 50 building independence waivers. Then they say, okay, we had 100 community living waivers. Let's go to the top of the urgent list and find the 100 most urgent people who need the services under the community living waiver, and we'll offer them that. And then they say, we got 1,000 of these family and individual supports waivers. Let's find 1,000 people on the waiting list who match well with that. And that's done in localities. So Arlington County gets specific waiver slots, waivers offered to them in these 3 categories, and their job is to do that matchmaking and reach out to families. And the Community Services Board in Arlington, the same place that you would apply for waivers, is the place that manages that waiting list. If you are on that waiting list, you are at any time in one of 3 priority tiers, priority 1, 2, or 3. Priority 1 is for folks most urgently in need, and they all have to get offered waivers before the state can move on to priority 2. And that's folks who need waivers here fairly soon, but are managing okay. Priority 3 is largely for people who are pretty young, pretty healthy, pretty stable, have caregivers in pretty good shape. Things are going along nicely. It would be nice to have a waiver, but we're okay without it for now. Maybe we're getting what we need through private insurance or private pay or the schools or the CCC Plus waiver, for example. At any given time, you can call the Community Services Board and ask which priority you're on. I really strongly encourage families to be in frequent contact with the Community Services Board to make sure that they are in the right priority tier. And by that, I mean, if your loved one reaches the teenage years and hormones make them as crazy as they make me, and all of a sudden you have new significant behavior needs or other kinds of things that are going on that are more difficult than they were before, that's the kind of thing you would call the CSB up and say, hey, I know before we were in priority 3, I think we need to inch up on that list. We're all of a sudden having some new challenges. Or if a parent or caregiver gets their own health diagnosis or has their own issues that are taking up time or financial resources that were otherwise devoted to the person with the disability, that's the kind of thing that can move someone higher up the waiting list. So be very frank with them and share with them as often as you can. For a little bit of perspective, in Virginia right now, there are about 13,000 people on the waiting list for waivers. About 3,000 of that 13,000 are in priority 1. And then the majority beyond that are in priority 2, and another significant minorities in priority 3. Like I said, no one gets funded in priority 2 or 3 until the folks in priority 1 are funded, until we've met that most urgent need. So again, really important to advocate for waivers, really important for yourself, for your family, but also on a larger scale. If you want to join the ARC's efforts to make sure that there are more waivers funded each year, by all means, you are more than welcome, and we would love to work with you on that. I hate saying this, but I can't give people even a rough time of how long that they would have to wait for waivers. It's so variable. I think 3 or 4 years ago, we asked DVHDS to just say, like, just pull an average, like give us a rough number. And at that time, again, remember, we're now looking at 4 or 5-year-old data. They said 7 years. Is that a realistic average of how long you would wait if you got on the waiting list today? Probably not. If someone is approaching graduation or at graduation years and doesn't have a waiver to kind of catch them and offer services after graduation, that's something that puts them in priority 1. But if you got on the waiting list when your loved one was 3 or 4 years old and you first got a diagnosis, maybe they would wait 10 or 15 or more years for a waiver. So you can see the 7-year average is really not a good reflection of how long you would wait. I only throw it out there to say, don't plan on a waiver being there immediately or even within a 1-2 couple of years kind of thing, unless there's an emergency situation. I am putting my contact information up here on the screen. I am happy to take any kind of questions that there are, and I'm happy to talk about what kind of happens when you have a waiver too, if we have any families on the line who have waivers now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop doing slides so we can just look at each other. Okay, there we are. And so, Christina, should I just be looking in the chat for questions?
I actually I wrote a number of questions that I usually get. So one, if you have the CCC Plus waiver, do you need to have Medicaid already in place?
To use the CCC Plus waiver, you will. So when you get the Medicaid, either of the waivers, the CCC Plus waiver or the DD waivers, you get one piece of paper that says, congratulations, you have gotten a waiver. And you get another piece of paper that says, go apply for Medicaid. Medicaid is going to use special rules to say you are eligible for Medicaid. Like I said, those special rules mean they're only looking at the income and assets of the person with a disability. They're looking at them more leniently than they would for regular Medicaid. And it's not until you have that Medicaid in place that you can start to use waiver services, because Medicaid is what pays for them. It's like billing health insurance for any other service.
And if you have the CCC Plus, that is all case managed through the health department.
Through the managed care plan. So a few years ago, Virginia switched to the system where instead of getting Medicaid, and a state office in Richmond funded that Medicaid and managed the Medicaid, they said, we're contracting this out. The state office in Richmond is going to hire these 6 for-profit insurance companies. And when you get Medicaid, you're going to be assigned to or can select one of these 6 insurance companies. So yeah, those insurance companies then are kind of your face of Medicaid. Aetna, Anthem, United, Virginia Premier, Optima. There's another one I'm forgetting. But those are them. And yeah, they'd be the people who would approve your services with the CCC Plus waiver, to be clear, with the CCC Plus waiver, because there's no case manager. They're the folks who approve your services and try to a very limited degree to help people navigate resources. But by comparison, CCC Plus waiver care coordinators is what they're called, have a caseload of usually 400 to 700 people who have Medicaid. So if you can imagine one staff person serving 400 to 700 people, that's about the percentage of their time that you're going to get. By comparison with the DD waivers, the Arlington Community Services Board case managers usually have a caseload in the mid-20s. So you would be expecting very frequent contact, at least monthly, if not more, far more hands-on assistance with the DD waiver.
My other question is, if you have the CCC Plus waiver, does that affect your priority level with the DD waiver?
Yes. So DD waiver priority, remember, is based upon urgency of need. What do you need? And do you not have resources to meet that need? So if, for example, you say like, we really need an in-home caregiver, that's we're on the waiting list, but we're getting that through the CCC Plus waiver. Well, then that means that the state's not going to see that that's an urgent need anymore. They're going to see that that's a need that's being met. So if you have the CCC Plus waiver, it's great because you really are getting some services right away. It more than likely is going to mean that your priority is lower on the DD waiver waiting list. You can start to show, but like I said, the CCC Plus waiver doesn't offer residential services. It doesn't offer day and employment services. It doesn't offer a case manager. It doesn't offer a host of other things. So if the needs that your loved one has are those things that the CCC Plus waiver doesn't offer, but the DD waiver does, that's the case you'll be making to the Community Services Board. You'll be saying, I know that I have something now, but the things I really need, I can't get. I can only get them with the DD waiver, and that's why I need the DD waiver. And that's the argument that you'll be making and the documentation, if you can write it, that you'll be showing them that'll move you higher up the waiting list.
And what is your best advice in helping establish the services of the DD waiver for an individual? For instance, if someone wanted to live in their own apartment and they wanted to have a part-time job and they needed help to navigate the community, how do you what is the best way a family can communicate those needs to get those services in place?
So assuming that this person has the waiver then, so like, then as soon as you have the waiver, the very first meeting that should happen is like a heavy duty, deep and real sit down with the Community Services Board case manager when they should get a really full picture of the life of the person with the disability. What do they do now? What do they need? A lot of the time that they're going to spend is going to be on writing goals. So like, what do you want to achieve in the next 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, I mean, all kinds of timelines, but they're really going to be talking about the strengths and needs of the person with a disability. So during that meeting, if your goal is to live in an independent housing situation in the next year, say, my goal is to live in an independent housing situation in the next year. Anything that is documented on that person's plan as a goal, in the same way you would document a goal in an IEP, anything that's documented in their waiver plan, that case manager is then responsible for. They are responsible for showing, we threw everything but the kitchen sink at this trying to make it happen, and we either did or didn't. But if there's a service that you want, that's the place to express it, and making sure that it's on that plan as a goal. And then they have to write quarterly reports saying this quarter, this person did or did not meet their goals, and this is why. Make sure you're continuously following up with them. We're still willing to tour. What else is there out there? You know, those kinds of things to push those to happen.
And then my last question of my frequently asked questions is, how often should an VIDES be done? And are families notified of the results of the VIDES after that meeting?
Yes, and the VIDES has to be done, first of all, when someone applies for a waiver, but then you are not going to see it again until the day the person gets a waiver. Once that person receives a waiver, every year, so much like an IEP, right? Like every year you have to meet, you have to renew the plan, you have to re-up the data, and every year at that same timeline, they're going to redo the VIDES. The VIDES is I mean, it depends upon how complicated an answer you want to give and the long-windedness of the support coordinator, but I would say 20 to 40 minutes is very standard for banging out a VIDES, like not a super long or comprehensive thing, especially if someone is well known, right? You're talking with the support coordinator a lot. They know what's going on. Those things go pretty quickly. So then you're told right there in the meeting, the support coordinator is the person who does the assessment, and you'll watch them check the boxes. Yep. You're eligible. That's all there is to it. And if you're not eligible, they're going to say, we can't continue planning the rest of your waiver services because you've lost eligibility. I've seen that happen once ever. Threats of it happening twice ever. And for perspective, I've seen many plans. So it's something that's pretty unusual. The other assessment, though, that we didn't talk about today is something called the SIS, which is the Supports Intensity Scale. And folks won't see that at all navigating the waiting list, but once they get a waiver, they will start to see it. And for children, they'll see it every 2 years, and for adults, they'll see it every 3 years. The VIDES by comparison is a test of waiver eligibility. That's all it is. You're continue to be eligible or you're not. A higher score or a lower score makes not a hoot of difference for anything that there is going on there. It's black and white, eligible or not, and it's fast. The SIS, Supports Intensity Scale Assessment, is long, like 2 to 4 hour meeting just for this assessment long, really in-depth conversations about needs. And you walk away from the SIS with a score, and the state is rapidly moving toward that SIS score is going to tie to the waiver services that you can get. So you want to make sure that that SIS score is really accurate. It's not something you have to worry about at all now. If you were just looking at waivers, if you're applying, if you're on the waiting list, it's totally irrelevant until the point at which you actually have a waiver, and then it starts to matter a lot. And then, like I said, it's only done every 2 years if you're a kid or 3 years if you're an adult. So all the more reason to make sure it's accurate, because that data is going to follow you around for a while.
And then one last question that I have is, and this has come up, if someone has a waiver and they, for whatever reason, would like a different county to manage their waiver, is that possible, and how does that work?
Yes, so that can happen for, generally speaking, one of two reasons. So I'll give 2 examples. Let's say there's someone in Arlington. I live in Arlington. Arlington's a small county, right? A relatively small community services board. They only have so many support coordinators. So let's say the person just said, like, you know what? I'm fed up with Arlington County support coordinators, or I feel like I've been wronged by the Arlington County CSB. I just don't want to work with them anymore. Then they can request a support coordinator through either Fairfax County or Alexandria City. I mean, you could request someone from somewhere else, but you're going to want to have somewhere close by if you're trying to get them to agree. Those local community services boards, Alexandria City and Fairfax, have the option to say, yes, we're willing to take on your case, or no, we are very full and we are not willing to take on your case. If someone has a developmental disability diagnosis that is not an intellectual disability, and this is tricky, and the way the state assesses this is essentially IQ score. If someone has a waiver and their IQ score is 71 up to infinity, then they can say, I either want another CSB to be my case manager, or I want a private case management group like the ARC of Northern Virginia to be my case manager. So way back in the beginning where I talked about some of the things that we do at the ARC and I said we are case managers, that's how. We're only allowed to do it for folks whose IQ is 71 plus, which has nothing to do with IQ or anything. It's a weird holdover that we could talk about for hours. But then in that case, they could request that the ARC of Northern Virginia become their case manager, and we're case manager for a number of people in Arlington. The flip of that is if an Arlington resident finds a residential placement not in Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Halifax, Blacksburg, wherever they want, as long as it's in the state of Virginia, then for the first handful of months, they'll stay with their Arlington County support coordinator. That support coordinator's job is to ease that transition and make sure everything goes well. After that handful of months, Arlington County has the discretion to say, really what we're supposed to do is to turn this case over to that new community services board where you live. Sometimes they are willing to make an exception. Those exceptions usually happen if the person is still living very close to Arlington, so you're not adding many, many hours of a commute to see you for these poor support coordinators on. But let's say the person moved to, I don't know, West Falls Church or whatever. Then it would be possible to say, like, is there any way I could keep my Arlington case manager? They've been the best ever. I've known them for 15 years. Like, they know our family. And sometimes they're willing to do that. So that's how sometimes folks end up with a support coordinator from a CSB that is not the CSB where they're living. It's very rare in the grand scheme of things, but not unusual.
Thank you for answering those. Does anybody have any other questions?
No, ma'am. Pretty straightforward.
God, Will, can you come to all my presentations and give that kind of feedback? Serious, man.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, though, Christina.
Oh, great.
Okay. Oh, I guess I can look through too. Sorry.
I don't see them.
Okay, so
Yeah, so they've been, Teams has been real wonky, so I'll ask maybe some of them for you that are written.
Thank you.
I think this one was covered, but someone asked if an individual can apply for both waivers, which I think that was covered.
Yeah.
And then someone asked about certificates offered for the training, which that might be a side question. Is there a pre-screen checklist to determine if the person would qualify for a DD or CCC plus waiver?
no, other than this presentation that you just watched. So if the person has a developmental disability diagnosis, that screening checklist really is the VIDES assessment that we talked about. The diagnosis already put you in the DD camp. You're going to do that VIDES to see, are we functionally eligible for the waiver? If you're looking at the CCC plus waiver, the closest to a pre-screening checklist is there a kind of disability diagnosis? Is there a kind of medical need? And then to do that self-assessment, or the UAI, those assessments that I linked like way in the beginning when we were talking about eligibility. But yes, absolutely, I'll share the slides to this, and I'll share like a 1 or 2 page waiver handout and our waiver recordings where we talk about different aspects of waivers and short or long versions or whatever. So like you'll leave tonight with more waiver information than you can shake a stick at. And you can happily get in touch with me anytime if you have quirky questions along the way navigating them.
And then is there a yearly check for someone who has the CCC plus waiver?
Yes, so the DD waiver, because you have that support coordinator, that case manager with the county who really is like doing more significant hands-on work with you, there's a lot more going on. For the CCC plus waiver, you still have a plan. It still is an annual plan. It still has to be renewed each year. So depending upon the services that you're getting, which usually are, I'm either hiring someone to come in my home and help me, or I'm hiring an agency to send someone in my home and help me. There are some exceptions, but those are the usual buckets. Then you either sit down with the person who's helping you hire those folks or the agency who's sending those folks, and you say, what are our needs for the next year? Have our support hour needs changed? You know, is there a change in work schedule or a change in support needs that we need to address? Is there a new service we want to add in? Those kinds of things. And you put in a request for that. So there is still an annual meeting and an annual assessment and an annual renewal of services, but it's not nearly as comprehensive as the planning and the supports under the DD waiver.
It looks like Commander Smith, I think, if I'm reading all of your acronyms there correctly, asks, is there a way to transfer DD or CCC plus waivers from county to county, i.e. Hampton to Arlington?
Yes. As long as you stay within the state of Virginia, waivers are state-based. So if you leave the state, you know, you're out of luck. But either of those waivers you can transfer. Or if you're, for example, like you're on the waiting list in Hampton, and then you get moved to Arlington, you would call the Arlington CSB and say like, hey, Arlington CSB, call up the Hampton CSB and have them send my file up here. And now I'm on your waiting list instead. Or likewise, hey, Arlington CSB, we have a waiver. Call up the Hampton CSB and have them send my service package up here. And the same as we talked about, if you moved out of Arlington, then the Hampton CSB would monitor you for a few months and get things all sorted out. And then they would turn things over to the Arlington CSB. That distance is too great that I would believe that a support coordinator would stay with someone no matter how much they loved you. For the CCC plus waivers, yes, same kind of thing. And that transfer is even easier. Insofar as there are fewer services to coordinate and to mishmash up. So you're just contacting your local department of, it depends on where you live, social services, family services, they call it different things. But if you have trouble finding the relevant department in another jurisdiction, I'm happy to help.
Any other questions in the chat, Jess? Thanks.
No, we've got someone typing, unless, Mr. Smith, if you want to ask your question, feel free. Oh, a break.
I can ask it, but I guess my other question is, does a break and live, like we lived in Maryland for 2 years in between, does that mean you have to start over?
Depends upon from where you were starting, which is such an obnoxious answer to give. So if you have, like, if you truly have a waiver, like you actually have services and you can use them and you move out of state and then you come back, yes, you really are starting over. I mean, if you're going back to the same CSB where you were before, it's not like they burned your files to the ground, right? So like they'll still have your old assessment. They'll still know that you have developmental disability and you're eligible. but you'll have to reapply. So for example, if what you had before was a DD waiver, you went out of state and you came back, you will go back on the waiting list. There was a law passed in Virginia 5-ish years ago that said if you are in the military and you're on the waiting list for the DD waivers and you leave the state, but you intend to come back, you can stay on the waiting list that whole time. So essentially you didn't lose your spot. You didn't have to reapply if you were on the waiting list.
Okay.
And so that's one relatively small benefit, but significant, I know, for a lot of families.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And one thing I just wanted to also note for families is that the transition coordinators that are at each of the homeschools, at the Career Center, at Shriver, are here to help you advocate or schedule meetings with your support coordinator and sort of help you navigate some of the things. We have asked, I think I've asked Lucy if Jupiter's rising and Saturn's in near will this happen, and she's been super helpful in help guiding us in terms of finding answers. So we will help you navigate as much as we can.
And I have to say, Arlington families, you have like truly the most amazing group of ETRs that I have ever seen. And Fairfax has some great ones, but like Arlington as a whole, you are in really good hands. And I've seen Christina and Joyce and Kelly and Karen and all kinds of folks there like really stick with families through. I mean, this is a bureaucratic process, right? Things can get lost, paperwork can go astray, someone can misfill out a piece of something. They really have stuck with families through it. So absolutely take them up on that offer to help. And I am happy to help them help you too along the way. Are we all out of questions? Okay. Then I'll say again, like, I'm happy to send the slides and the link to the waiver one-pager and the link to some waiver recordings and anything anybody else wants to ask for as a follow-up to the ETR team that they can send out to families. And people are welcome to ask me questions anytime. It's a huge part of what we do. And because I'm at home on the computer all day instead of ever driving to meetings at this point, I'm usually pretty fast at answering questions I get via email. So you can expect a rapid response.
Thank you, Lucy, so much. We really appreciate it. And I'm Kelly with the Parent Resource Center, and I will be glad to send out the copy of the PowerPoint, the handouts, and we are also recording, as everyone knows. So we'll get that on the PRC, our website, and probably the Parent Academy as well.
And then I don't know